Assalamu alaikum. So, what is the concept of wahy, or what we always translate as revelation or inspiration? What I want to suggest is that wahy is perhaps the same process that we now know as creativity, but at the time, because we didn't understand things like we do now, we didn't have the tools that we have now, or the way of perceiving things that we have now, the way of analyzing things that we have now. Perhaps that's the name that we had for that process at the time, wahy. And what we would call that process today is creativity. So the people that we would understand as being prophets and messengers would be what we would understand now as being creative geniuses. Now, that doesn't mean, because the automatic objection for that would be, what are you saying then that that's not something that came from Allah? I'm not saying that. I'm saying perhaps that is how Allah communicates His wahy, is through utilizing these creative geniuses who have this gift of creativity. So the first point is, I think any concept in the Quran should be understood from the natural world, right? We can understand any concept from the Quran within the natural world. And that's because Allah says in the Quran, سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقِّ, that we will show them our ayat, or our signs, in the afaq, in all of the horizons around them, and in themselves, until they know that it's the truth. So in this verse, he says he will show the ayat, he will show us his ayat, his signs and his lessons, fil afaqi, in all of the different horizons around us. So how do we learn his signs in the horizons around us? By studying the natural world, by studying physics and geology and chemistry and all these different things. And wafi anfusihim, and in themselves. So by studying psychology, sociology, and the sciences connected to understanding the self and the person, in these two ways, he says he will show us his ayat until it becomes clear to them that it is al-haq, that it is the truth. So how do we know the truth of the concepts of the Quran? How do we understand the concepts of the Quran in a true way? Is by studying the natural world. So we apply that same concept to the idea of wahy, what we normally translate as revelation, then we can see why that might be connected to creativity, and that might be the name that was given to creativity when these creative geniuses were receiving this inspiration. So first of all, let's look at the connection between wahy, or what we call revelation, and rams, or symbolism, or using symbols or symbolic meanings. So in chapter 19, verse 11, Allah says, فَخَرَجَ عَلَى قَوْمِهِ مِنَ الْمِحْرَابِ. So this is talking about Zachariah, or Zachariah. He came out upon his people from al-mihrab. فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ. He did wahy to them, and سَبِّحُوا بُكْرَةً وَعَشِيًّا, that glorify Allah in the morning and the evening. So when he came out from his mihrab, it says فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ. He gave wahy to them, right? Gave wahy to his people. So first of all, this also supports the idea that wahy is a natural process, which is a part of the natural world, because this is something that a human being is able to do to other human beings. Now, if we compare this verse to another verse about Zechariah, which is chapter 3, verse 41, it says, chapter 3, verse 41, he says, قال رب اجعل لي آية. He said, my Lord, make for me an ayah. قال آيتك ألا تكلم الناس ثلاثة أيام إلا رمزا. He said, your ayah is that you will not speak to people for 3 days except ramzan. Except ramzan. Ramzan basically means through symbols and signs. Okay? So when you put the two verses together, in one verse, فَأَوْحَى إِلَيْهِمْ, he gave them wahy. In another verse, it says you will not speak to them except ramzan, through symbols and signs. So as some scholars of Arabic describe it, rams could be something you do with your eye, or something like a signal you give. So wahy is a signal, is a symbol, right? That the person can see this symbol and understand it. So if you really, really think about that, that's actually really deep, because what does a symbol tell us, right? A symbol isn't necessarily the whole idea spelled out, right? Just word for word spelled out. a symbol gives us a visual summary of an idea, right? Or some kind of a summary of an idea that when we understand and process the symbol, then we can understand what the idea was. So this is one way to think about wahy, is it comes through symbols. So when it comes to creativity, people who engage in creative pursuits can take inspiration from symbols, from things that don't spell out the whole idea. They can look at, for example, a painting, or they can hear a song, or they can see a bird, and that can represent anything. Like they can see a bird and that can represent freedom, and then they can have this whole idea about how to connect birds to freedom, and write poetry about it, or write essays about it, or give talks about it. But that bird was rams for them. It symbolized a concept. It symbolized a whole concept. So perhaps that's an idea of what wahy can be like. One idea of what wahy can be like. It's this powerful idea that is placed within you based upon symbols, based upon things you might hear, based upon things you might read. And it's not necessarily telling you all of the details, but it inspires you to think in a particular way. So I think it's really beautiful to start with this verse that Zachariah actually awha. He gave this inspiration to his people. I mean, even if you think about it in another way, how can a person give you wahy? So another way is you meet a person and they don't actually say anything to you. Maybe you don't even meet them in person, face to face. You're just like in the room with them and you observe them. There's something about them, like they're really kind, they're really nice people. Maybe you see how they interact with others. Maybe you see them giving charity, and that inspires you to be a better person. But you don't actually talk and meet that person at all. It gives you wahy. They symbolize the idea. They are a rams. They are a symbol of what it means to be a good person, and that gives you inspiration. So I think it's a really interesting way to think about wahy and rams, wahy and symbolism in Revelation. So let's also look at some of the other verses that talk about wahy and how that can be connected to the natural world. So for example, the bee, Allah says in 1668, وَأَوْحَى رَبُّكَ إِلَى النَّحْلِ. Your Lord inspired or gave wahy to the bee. So some kind of way that Allah placed certain information that the bee knows within itself in order to be able to accomplish certain things or to do certain things. Allah called that wahy. That's a part of the natural world. And then if you look at another verse, he says, يَوْمَئِذٍ, speaking about the day of judgment, يَوْمَئِذٍ تُحَدِّثُ أَخْبَارَهَا, about the earth at that time. That day it would speak about its akhbar, all of its news and information, بِأَنَّ رَبَّكَ أَوْحَى لَهَا, because your Lord has inspired it or gave it wahy, right? So he connects the idea of the earth being able to speak about its information to the idea of giving it wahy. And we know the earth is a part of the natural world. In 5:111, he speaks about giving wahy to the hawariyin, as we usually translate them as being the disciples of Jesus. Personally, I don't like that translation because I think the word hawariyin has more depth to it, which we can explore in another video. But he says here in 5:111, وَإِذْ أَوْحَيْتُ إِلَى الْحَوَارِيِّينَ أَنْ آمِنُوا بِي وَبِرَسُولِي. And when we gave wahy to al-hawariyin, that believe in me and believe in my messenger. So that's a situation where they weren't prophets or messengers, and they still had wahy given to them to inspire them to believe in him, to believe in Allah. He said, Aminu bi, believe in me and my messenger. Also, with the story of Yusuf or Joseph when he was placed in the well, right? Allah gave him wahy, and this is at the very beginning of his story when he was still young. He said, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْهِ لَتُنَبِّئَنَّهُمْ بِأَمْرِهِمْ هَذَا وَهُمْ لَا يَشْعُرُونَ. This is in 12:15. And we gave wahy to him that you will certainly inform them of this matter of theirs while they don't perceive it. So think about that. They gave him, he said, we gave him wahy at this very young age, right, when he was thrown into the well, that you will inform them of this matter of theirs. So perhaps what's being said is, or how we can think about that is, do you know, like when you go through an experience in life and you have a situation, and you say to yourself, or you have this idea, like, that person, they may have neglected me, or they may have treated me this way, but once I, I'm gonna accept that, and I'm gonna move on, and then I'm gonna better myself, and I'm gonna do better, and then at some point in my life, or in their life, they're gonna look and see and regret that they didn't treat me better, for example, right? This is what this reminds me of, because he says, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَيْهِ لَتُنَبِّئَنَّهُم بِأَمْرِهِمْ هَذَا. We gave him wahy, that you will inform them about this affair of theirs. There will come a time when it will come full circle, and you'll tell them about this thing that they did. But see, the wahy, what I want us to try to think about is thinking about wahy as a natural process and not a supernatural process, that everything exists as a part of the natural world. So when he says we gave wahy to him, and when we talk about that kind of an idea that we have, that we kind of look ahead and we think, okay, this person is going to see one day that they kind of messed up. Perhaps that's what wahy is, that feeling or that thought that you have that you're going to be okay, and it's going to come full circle, and this person is going to see, what they did. Perhaps that's what wahy is. That's that inspiration or that creativity to think of things that don't yet exist, because that's part of what creativity is, right? You take the pieces of something that might exist. You might take several different pieces that exist, and you put them together, and you create something new that hasn't been seen yet. And that could be in the physical world, or that could be in the world of ideas, just by looking ahead and being a visionary and realizing that a certain set of events is going to play out in a certain way. So that's part of what creativity is, and perhaps that's what wahy is referring to. He talks about in another verse, chapter 20, verse 38. He says, وَلَقَدْ مَنَنَّا عَلَيْكَ مَرَّةً أُخْرَى, and we have bestowed our favor upon you at another time. إِذْ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَى أُمِّكَ مَا يُوحَى, when we inspired to your mother what was inspired. We gave wahy to your mother of what was given wahy of. And this is talking about the mother of Musa. So this is not necessarily a person who was a prophet or a messenger. This was a person like me and you, an average everyday person who was given wahy, in some inspiration to do something. Also, if we look in chapter 6, verse 121, وَإِنَّ الشَّيَاطِينَ لَيُوحُونَ إِلَىٰ أَوْلِيَائِهِمْ لِيُجَادِلُوكُمْ. And the shayateen, لَيُوحُونَ, they inspire, they give wahy to their supporters, لِيُجَادِلُوكُمْ, in order to debate and to argue with you. So wahy is also a process that the shayateen can engage in. And in another verse that speaks about shayateen al-insi wal-jinn, in chapter 6, 112, he says, يُوحِي بَعْضُهُمْ إِلَى بَعْضٍ زُخْرُفَ الْقَوْلِ غُرُورًا, that they inspire one another, they give wahy to one another, زُخْرُفَ الْقَوْلِ, adorned speech, غُرُورًا, by means of deception. And in another verse, he speaks about a messenger being able to give wahy. So he says, وَمَا كَانَ لِبَشَرٍ أَن يُكَلِّمَهُ اللَّهُ, and this is in chapter 42, verse 51. وَمَا كَانَ لِبَشَرٍ أَن يُكَلِّمَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَّا وَحْيًا, and it is not for any human being that Allah would speak to him except wahyan, except through some kind of inspiration, أَوْ مِنْ وَرَاءِ حِجَاب, or from behind a veil or a partition or a screen, أَوْ يُرْسِلَ رَسُولًا, or he sends a messenger, فَيُوحِيَ بِإِذْنِهِ مَا يَشَاءُ, and that messenger does wahy of his permit. فَيُوحِيَ بِإِذْنِهِ مَا يَشَاءُ, he does wahy فَيُوحِيَ, by his permission, whatever he wills. So from these verses, and Allah knows best, we can see that wahy is perhaps not the supernatural kind of like mystical or kind of spooky concept that we might have thought it to be. Perhaps wahy is a natural process that takes place in the natural world with people on a daily basis throughout history. There's been creative geniuses. So if you think about it, if you think about the connection between wahy and creativity, And of course, there's more we can explore about this topic. There's more research that needs to be done. This is just a beginning suggestion, just to think about, to have a different way of thinking about it. But if you think about what people who engage in creativity do, they, like I said before, they take these pieces of things that might exist, right? These ideas from here and there, and then they kind of put them together in a very unique way. And a lot of times they don't even know where that sudden flash of insight came from. So if you study even scientific discoveries, if you go back and you study someone like Albert Einstein, right? So he would like do thought experiments where he would just like picture and imagine riding next to a light beam and what that would be like. So when you study the history of different geniuses, different people who made breakthroughs in science and philosophy in these different fields, you can kind of see the process of creativity at work where they just have these like sudden insights. And yes, then they have to research and back them up and make sure the math adds up and all that type of stuff. But if you study that process, it feels very much like wahy, this way in the natural world that exists of conveying information to you suddenly by symbols, without words, and without you necessarily being able to see where it came from. And another thing about creativity is that people who engage in creativity often have, like, if you study the process of creativity, like, there's a whole process that people who engage in creativity go through. So one of the things is they prepare the ground for creative breakthroughs. So even when I study the Quran, that's how I engage in it. So if I want to study a concept in the Quran and I want to have a creative breakthrough in trying to understand something, I know the first thing I got to do is prepare my mind. And how do I prepare my mind is I want to read all the verses and information that I can find about that subject. And I know for the most part when I do that, I'm only going to be like 40-50% of the way in understanding it. There's still going to be some blocks and I'm not going to be sure of what I'm getting at. But what I do after that is I kind of walk away from whatever it is, do something else, and let my subconscious mind kind of play with it and work with it. And then you'll notice there'll be one piece of information. This is what happens to me all the time. There's one piece of information that you come across, or one thing that you see, or one thing that you hear. And that one thing is the rams. It's the symbol that you needed that breaks it, like they say, breaks the case open. And then all of a sudden it all clicks. And I think that's what the process of wahy is. And as we saw in the Quran, wahy isn't just for a prophet and messenger. The mother of Musa, for example, the shayateen did it, the disciples had it, right? And as the Quran says in another place, أَكَانَ لِلنَّاسِ عَجَبًا أَنْ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَىٰ رَجُلٍ مِّنْهُمْ أَنْ أَنذِرِ النَّاسِ. Is it amazing to people that we did wahy to a man from amongst them, saying, warn the people? So if we were to suggest that and say, yeah, there's a possibility that you could be given wahy based on some of these verses, doesn't mean that you're a prophet or a messenger necessarily. Doesn't mean only the prophets and messengers get wahy. They would be like, oh no, that's crazy, right? But here he says, أَكَانَ لِلنَّاسِ عَجَبًا أَنْ أَوْحَيْنَا إِلَىٰ رَجُلٍ مِّنْهُمْ. Is it amazing, or is it a surprise that we would give wahy to a man from amongst them? So I think it's an interesting connection to explore, the possibility that wahy and creativity could just be two names for the same thing. And Allah knows best. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.